Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 15, the date and authorship of the Book of Splendour, Book 3, Source and Authority of the Kabalah, from the Doctrine and Literature of the Kabalah by Arthur Edward Waite. 3. The date and authorship of the Book of Splendour. The theory which accounts for the Zohar on the ground that it was written by Moses de Leon in the latter half of the 13th century does not depend merely on internal evidence. It is not exclusively an inference made by modern criticism from allusions to late events found here and there in the work. It is not a presumption arising only from the fact that the Spanish Jew who is suspected of the splendid imposture lived by transcribing copies of it, that it had never been heard of previously, or that the original manuscript from which our Moses claimed to have drawn has never come to light. It is based upon evidence which claims to be contemporary, or thereabouts with the appearance of the Zohar itself. It may be highly probable that in the absence of any such testimony, the same point would have been reached independently, but the fact remains that it is not the discovery of modern criticism at all. It transpired without being sought for, and hence the case against the work is based both on external and internal grounds. It is not therefore at first sight a weak case, and I have sketched it fully and frankly, that I may not be accused of any bias in the matter. At the same time, it is my purpose to show that the indictment breaks down altogether. Let us dispose first of all of the alleged external evidence. In the year 1566, there appeared in Hebrew at Constantinople a work entitled Sefer Yuhasin, or Book of Genealogies, by our Moses Abraham ben Samuel Zakut, who belongs to the second half of the 15th century. Its point of view with regard to the Zohar is that the splendor of that work is truly an illumination of the world, that it contains the deep secrets of the law and of the concealed tradition in Israel, that it is conformed to the truth as regards the written and oral law, that it embodies the sayings of our Simeon ben Yochai of the period of the Emperor Antoninus, under whose name it appears but is really the work of his disciples, and that finally it did not become public till after the death of Nachmanides, namely the second half of the 13th century. It is therefore obvious that Zakut must not be classed among those who opposed the Zohar, as some modern critics have attempted. It will seem almost incredible that in this work, which so elaborately defends the Zohar, a narrative should appear which represents it as an imposture devised from mercenary motives by Moses de Leon. Yet such at first sight is the case, and as such it has been accepted by those who impeach the Kabalah. The explanation is in reality simple. The narrative in question is a fragment, and the proof that its missing conclusion is really to the credit of the Zohar, and exculpatory as to the transcriber of that work, is found in the fact that the person whose adventures it relates became subsequently assured that the Zohar was not a sordid forgery, as he embodied some of its principles in one of his own treatises. The most biased of modern critics, Dr. Graetz, admits the force of this fact. The narrative is concerned with the adventures of Isaac de Acco, a disciple of Nachmanides who laid claim to the performance of miracles by a transposition of the Hebrew letters according to a system which he pretended that he had learned from the angels. Independently, therefore, of the Zohar, he was a Kabbalist after his own fashion, and we may suspect a visionary. In either case, he was at Novara in Italy about 1293 when he heard that a Spanish rabbin was in possession of the original Zohar manuscripts, and being very anxious to see them, he made a journey into Spain. He there learned by report that the erudite Moses Nachmanides was said to have transmitted the book to his son in Catalonia from Palestine, but that the ship which bore it was driven by the wind to Aragonia or to Catalonia, and the precious volume came into the hands of Moses de Leon. At Valladolid, Isaac de Acco made the acquaintance of the latter, who declared upon oath that he was in possession of the manuscript, and that it was at his home in Avila, where he would exhibit it to Isaac. They undertook a journey together with this object, but Moses de Leon died at Arevalo on the way. His companion proceeded to Avila, and there prosecuted his inquiries among the relatives of the deceased. By one of these, namely by David Raffon of Corfu, he was informed that Moses de Leon had been a spendthrift who derived great profit from his writings, but neglected his wife and daughter, while as for the Zohar, he had made it up out of his own head. How far Isaac was impressed by this statement does not appear explicitly, but he next had recourse to a wealthy rabbin of Avila named Joseph, who communicated with the widow and daughter of Moses, offering for the maiden the hand of his son and a substantial dowry if they would produce the original manuscript of the Zohar. The women had been left in poor circumstances, and there was every reason to suppose that they would comply gladly. They, however, concurred in affirming that there was no such manuscript, that the dead man had composed the work out of his own head and written it with his own hand. His quest having thus failed, Isaac Diaco left Avila and proceeded to Talavera, where he met with R. Joseph Halavi, the son of a Kabbalist named Todros, who in reply to his inquiries affirmed that the genuine Zohar was in the hands of Moses de Leon, as he had himself proved conclusively. The nature of the proof does not appear, and the account of Isaac breaks off abruptly in the middle of a sentence describing some testimony which he received at Toledo as to an ancient rabbin named Jacob, who had testified by heaven and earth that the book Zohar, of which R. Simeon ben Yochai is the author. I've passed over purposely in this brief account several minor details which have awakened suspicion as to the honesty of the narrative, for it is unnecessary to confuse the issues. The point is that it closes with two solemn testimonies to the authenticity of the Zohar, and by the course which he subsequently took, Isaac de Acco must have concluded to abide by these. Assuming that the narrative is truthful, the evidence which was set aside as insufficient by the one person who has recorded it cannot be accepted by impartial criticism, unenforced by other considerations. So far, therefore, as the account in the Sefer Yuhassin is concerned, it is not proved that Moses de Leon wrote the Zohar out of his own head. Zakut himself mentions an opinion that he did write it under the guidance of the writing name, that is, by angelic revelation. But I do not conceive that it is necessary to discuss this possibility. The state of the case as it stands is confused, and most persons who have taken part in the controversy have been led into more or less contradiction. Those who have regarded Moses de Leon as nothing more than a transcriber have had to reckon as they could with certain damaging references to late events which are found in the Zohar, and their explanations are often quite worthless. Those who regard the transcriber as the concealed author have had to meet as they might the extreme difficulty of supposing that such a collection was the production of one individual, and that individual Moses de Leon. Their explanations also are of little value and are for the most part merely ingenious assumptions. The internal evidence against the Zohar may be reduced under the following heads. 1. It refers to the vowel points which are alleged to have been invented in post-Talmudic times. 2. It quotes or borrows from a book entitled The Duties of the Heart, written by a Jew of Saragossa about the middle of the 11th century. 3. It mentions two kinds of phylacteries or tephilim, which fact is supposed to prove the late origin of the entire work. 4. It quotes authorities posterior to its alleged period. 5. It is written in Aramaic, whereas at the period to which it is ascribed Aramaic was the vernacular, while Hebrew was made use of in religious writings. These difficulties are met by defenders of the Zohar in the following way. 1. The vowel points are not the invention of times posterior to the Talmud. The proof is that they are mentioned in the Talmud, and there is no question that this work is long anterior to the 13th century. In the Talmud, there is said to have been a rule given to Moses on Mount Sinai. The pre-Christian existence of the point system, with the exception of a very few cases occurring in the Pentateuch, which moreover are not vowel points, this is one thing and must be left to those who affirm it. Its existence in Talmudic times, that is prior to the close of the 6th century, is another, and all that is required in the present case to destroy the validity of this objection to the genuine character of the Zohar. 2. The treatise on the duties of the heart is certainly a work of the 11th century, but it is advanced that its author himself borrowed from the Zohar in an early form, the existence of which is traceable from Talmudic references under the name of the Midrash of Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai. It is also said that the author was a contemporary of Rabbi Abraham, who wrote a commentary of repute upon the Book of Formation. But this mysterious personage, the pretended instructor of Nicholas Flamel in the secrets of alchemy, died at the close of the 12th century. As it is obvious that the objection with which we are here concerned is equivalent to begging the question at issue, so it is fairly met by the opposite assumption. It is unserious and may be dismissed. 3. The existence of two kinds of phylacteries arose through a difference of rabbinical opinion as to the scriptural passages to be used on them. The question is whether this difference of opinion occurred in the 11th century and later, or whether it originated in earlier Talmudic times. Certain statements and inferences therefrom are set forth by defenders of the Zohar in support of High Second view. But the use of two kinds of phylacteries before the 10th century has not been clearly demonstrated. 4. The citation by the Zohar of late authorities belonging to the Amoraim school is met by representing it in its present form as the growth of several centuries, which is provably true of most early Hebrew literature, canonical or not. The indirect strength of this view is considerable, but it is much weakened by its supporters when they attempt to argue that had the Zohar been forged by Moses de Leon, he would have carefully avoided the citation of later authorities. The history of literary impostures points wholly in the opposite direction, and the objection demonstrates quite clearly that the work as we have it is later than its latest authority. For it to be otherwise is impossible. How the late authorities came to be included is a distinct matter. 5. When Isaac Diaco set out on his quest for the original manuscript of the Zohar, he is recorded to have said, "If it be written in the Jerusalem idiom, it is genuine, but if in Hebrew, it is not." The value of an objection to the Zohar founded on its use of Aramaic is here exhibited by the express statement of a Jewish litterateur in the 13th century. It is argued furthermore by its defenders, A.A., that Aramaic is the language of the Targums, which are mystical. B, that the common language is used to increase the symbolism, but this may be regarded as a subtlety. C, that supposing the antiquity of the Zohar, the scribe of Simeon ben Yochai was undoubtedly the Rabbi Abba that it mentions, and he as a Babylonian must have been thoroughly conversant with Aramaic. D, that supposing the Zohar to be a forgery produced by Moses de Leon, he was more likely to have written it in Hebrew, which is the language of his other books. From these objections and these answers, the general conclusion must be that the internal evidence for the late origin of the bulk of the Zohar as it stands is not of any real force. The two tabulations have by no means exhausted the difficulties or the counter-evidence, as to which, even at the present day, Frank is in many cases the best and certainly the most lucid expositor. The absence of Christian influence, if not absolutely of all reference to Christianity, the absence also of Aristotelian influence, and some points of the argument from the dialect in which the work is written, seem to possess as much force as they did originally in 1843. But the strength of the case in favor of the Zohar is also the strength of the chief objection against it. It does quote later authorities, but this may exhibit that it grew like the Talmudic writings and several of the canonical Hebrew books. It has been well urged that if contemporary with the Talmud, the latter ought to have mentioned it, and it is replied that it does, not however under the catchword of its late name, but by the title of the Secret Learning and by other titles which have been mentioned in this section. It would exceed the province of an elementary work to pursue the subject further. The minute considerations are of course highly technical, and there are some on both sides which it is wise to abstain from pressing. One of these is the argument that Moses de Leon was an unlikely person to have written such a work as the Zohar, because he was intellectually and morally unfit. I have noted that he was unlikely, but possibilities of this kind can only be determined by the event. Many great books have been accomplished by persons who were antecedently improbable, and after all, at the best, we know Moses de Leon only through the testimony of a hostile relative. There is no doubt that the Zohar was to some extent sprung upon the Jewish people at the period of its publication. The manner of its reception was not unmixed. It was the kind of reception which would be given to a work which was old, as regards its materials, but unfamiliar less or more in its form, and this is sufficient to account for any silence of previous authorities. While in the shaping of those materials and the impressing of that form, the individual who multiplied the copies may have had a hand. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.